Hey, good afternoon, everyone. How was everybody today? Thank you all for. Thanks again for getting the microphone. Welcome on a Sunday afternoon to the Museum of Chinese America. My name is Michael Lee. I'm the president here. We don't usually do, programming on Sundays afternoons. Not exactly the time where you try and draw the largest crowd, but we had just a moment in time to do this, and scheduling only allowed for this afternoon. And the reason why there's only a moment in time to do this is because we just have the amazing coincidence where we developed, this is the bit that you're sitting in right now, based on Asian American magazines that came out from the 70s to the 2000s. And one of the most seminal magazines during that time was A Magazine. And Jeff Yang was the illustrious founder. At the same time, a huge moment for Asian Americans on Broadway. David Henry Hwang's Critic's Pick, Yellowface, is out right now. Let's give a huge round of applause for that. And so when Jeff approached us, he said, "Oh, I've been wanting to come to New York. I've been wanting to do a podcast with David." And I just said, "Oh, well, this is the only moment in time we're going to be able to do this podcast in this room while these two shows are going on." And I think that is such an important part of history for us, and the fact that we're so interconnected as Chinese Americans, to be able to, kind of work together and talk about it and dialogue about it and just know what and see each other's success. Because I think when A Magazine came out and Yellowface came out 15 years ago, right? Right? So everything was at much different places back then, and so the time warp now to where we are now, and Jeff's son doing television shows, and David, the theater that it's in, the Yellowface is now, is probably twice as large or 3 times as large. Yeah, it's just a wonderful evolution, but the fact that we're so interconnected and the relationships are all still there, though, it's a beautiful thing for our community. So we're so happy that you guys could be here for this special talk. I don't think it's necessarily about the numbers in this room, but more about the wonderful content and dialogue that we're going to get to witness, and everybody's going to get to witness, thanks to Jeff's podcast called They Call Us Bruce. That's right. So anyway, without further ado, again, a little bit about the museum. The Museum of Chinese American is dedicated to preserving, illuminating, and celebrating the rich history and contributions of Chinese in America here. So this is obviously part of our history, and we're so thrilled to have it. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. Thank you all for being here.
All right, and thank you guys so much for making time on your Sunday afternoon for this. I know some of you have come from great distances and lesser distances, Boston, and gathering here in this space especially brings a little tear to my eyes, not least because this is a place where history is preserved, and I feel all of a sudden like we're kind of a living exhibit of that history. But the opportunity here to speak with a good longtime friend, somebody who's been both an inspiration, a role model, a leader in so many different ways in our community, in our culture, you never pass up that opportunity, and certainly never pass up that opportunity to do it in front of an audience. So getting a chance to talk to David already is fantastic. We're going to be doing this as a live episode of our podcast, They Call Us Bruce. We do They Call Us Bruce, myself and Phil Yu, Angry Asian Man, approximately weekly. We've got hundreds of episodes. We have a kind of a signature format. The first half of the podcast is just, standard conversation, conversational interview. And then the second half is something we call the good, the bad, and the WTF, which is our sort of signature roundtable format conversation, where we ask our guests to share with us the good, the positive, the bad, the negative, and finally the WTF, interpret as you will, of a certain thing. So when we get to that, I'll kind of redefine and invite David to share those 3 things. But that break, that will come after the break, and the break will maybe give you guys a chance to stretch a little bit. We really won't take a break. After about 40 minutes or so, after both of those segments, I do want to open it up for live questions from the audience, and that probably won't make it to the podcast, but it's the opportunity for all of us to be part of the conversation. And with that, I will kick this off first by introducing our special guest, David Henry Hwang, iconic playwright, and of course the visionary behind so many culture-moving works from FOB, M. Butterfly, Soft Power, and of course, currently on Broadway at the Roundabout Theater. Get your tickets now while you still can. Yellowface, which, again, for those who have seen it, it is mind-bending how a work that came from 2007 is so persistently relevant, and maybe even more resonant than ever before today. David, thank you so much. Welcome to the podcast. Woo!
Jeff, as soon as I became aware of you, with acting, I thought, wow, this is someone who's so smart, so insightful, and really can move the needle.
Oops.
So all my compliments to Jeff did not heard by anyone. But I said, as soon as I first heard Jeff, and A magazine came out, I felt this is someone who's so smart, so insightful, such a great cultural critic, and can move the needle. So I am really happy that we're doing this and I'm talking to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for repeating the agreed upon compliments twice.
I memorized them.
But honestly, you have been such a big part of my adult life in so many ways. I think I shared this with you before, but the first play I ever directed was FOB when I was in college. And from that point on, even when we actually launched A Magazine, which again is part of the exhibit here at the Museum of Chinese America, of magazines from the 90s, you were one of the people who we had reached out to as both kind of an advisor, as somebody who could help us find a way into the conversation. And actually, your family, your father, was really instrumental in actually helping us get started, right? So there's a lot of backstory and a lot of interweaving of our lives that probably a lot of people don't know, but which makes, in some ways, not just this conversation, but Yellowface, the play, very kind of intimate and personal to me. I want to begin with that, actually, because this is again, a play that you first put on in 2007. And it is a play that is about a play, and about reactions to that play, and about reactions to that play. It's a work of inception that just is mind-boggling. But it follows from, of course, the Miss Saigon controversy, however we want to frame it, where Jonathan Pryce, white actor, was cast as the biracial Asian lead of Miss Saigon. And that moment was something you were very much in the center of. So I want to wind the clock back to that era and ask that David Henry Hwang of that era, what was he thinking when he first entered into that conversation? What did you think he could do? And then what happened instead?
Yeah, so for those of you who are not so familiar with that history, the musical Miss Saigon, when it first came to Broadway, it's just that Jonathan Pryce was cast as the role of the mixed-race Asian pimp or lead called the engineer. And this led to kind of the first major yellow-face protest in New York theater history, and was kind of an early culture wars flashpoint. And I decided to get involved with it in 1990. Part of this is told in the play Yellowface, through a call from David Hwang, and wrote a letter. But one of the things that's not in the play is my own history with that sort of protest. To some extent, my career started because of a Yellowface protest 10 years prior. At the Public Theater here in New York City, a white actor got cast in an Asian role. And this led to yellow-face protests back when I was still a senior in college, where the Asian actors of that day, who were few in number and had very little power, protested in front of the Public Theater on Lafayette Street. And Joseph Papp, the founder, called them into his office and hired one of them, a guy named David Oyama, onto his staff with a brief to find plays for Asian actors. And it was just about that time that my play FOB, which I'd written to be done in the lounge of my dormitory in college, came across their desk. So I'm really the beneficiary of an affirmative action program, because that's what affirmative action is, right? It identifies a social need, and then it creates a program to try to address that. And Joe sort of created his own affirmative action program. But therefore, someone had paid that forward to me, paid it back before. I'm not even sure how that would work. But so therefore, when another bigger yellow-face incident came up, it was really only right that I would get involved.
That lends such a context to why you'd actually take this kind of human capital that you'd accrued, this cultural capital you'd accrued from the success of Pen Butterfly, right? And then kind of put it on the line and say, hey, I'm going to try to use this little lever to move, Cameron McIntosh, the biggest impresario in the world at the time, and try to shame him to some degree to do the right thing. But he didn't, right?
Right, and arguably, I was what was the equivalent of being canceled in those days, canceled by sort of mainstream media and opinion makers, in the sense that just about everybody in the New York and American cultural establishment came out against our position, with the notable exception of Joseph Papp, by the way. Joe supported us. But everybody else, kind of called this an example of political correctness run amok. So looking back, and I think I've only realized this in this current revival, as we were rehearsing it, now in 2024, I realized, I think I was sort of traumatized by the whole thing. And, what it meant to stand up to, not to line of the play, stand up to white supremacy, and how much of a backlash you get, how pissed off people get. And so I started to process that the way that I do most things that upset me through my work. And I wrote a comedy called Face Value, which then became one of the biggest flops in Broadway history, certainly in the last 30 or 40 years, closing in previews. So that did not, that was not salve for my trauma. And then another 10 years went by, and I thought of a way to reconfigure that basic concept, a comedy of mistaken racial identity, into a different form. Face Value was more of a slamming doors farce, and Yellowface is more of a stage documentary.
I think what is really brilliant about even just the provenance of Yellowface is the degree to which, much like our Chinese forebears, you will leave no scrap unrecycled into tomorrow's feast. And there is a sense in which every version of the story, as it's been told by you and by others, ends up working its way into the way Yellowface emerges. But this was back in 2007, and I want to kind of put a pin in this, right? I want to make Asian America back in the 2007s again for a moment here, because this was a moment when it felt like we were kind of on the cusp of breaking through in the culture, where we were about to elect our first Black president, where it felt like diversity and inclusion weren't just buzzwords anymore, they were a mandate. And the show not only interrogates some of those ideas, because it's not cleanly saying, it's not cleanly an attempt by you to basically rationalize yourself. If anything, one of the most remarkable things about Yellowface, and frankly about a lot of your work, is the degree to which you're willing to hang out dirty laundry, and like create sort of self-deprecating versions of yourself. And Yellowface certainly does not make you the hero of this story. So I'm kind of curious, as we were getting ready to put this on stage, what you were thinking. Where did you think it was going to land with people? Did you think people were going to embrace it and say, oh yes, now I understand everything now? Or did you, at the time, feel like it was still maybe going to be pushing limits, perhaps?
Yeah, so for those who particularly might be listening to this and not know the story of Yellowface, I should probably just give a one-sentence summary. It's about an Asian American playwright named D.H.H. who protests the casting of Jonathan Pryce as the Eurasian pimp in his cycle, then accidentally casts a white actor as the Asian lead in his own follow-up to M. Butterfly called Face Valley. And when he finds out that the actor is actually 100% white, he tries to cover up his blunder to protect his reputation as an Asian American role model. So, you know, that is not a totally flattering portrayal of the D.H.H. character. In fact, D.H.H. is the butt of most of the jokes in the show, and you know, the person who's making all the mistakes through most of the show until the end. He does arguably a moment of redemption. And yes, Jeff, when I think about 2007, it felt like all these issues around what we then most usually refer to as multiculturalism had been pretty much resolved. And we may recall that a little later, when Obama did get elected, you know, there was this whole talk about being a post-racial society, that we solved racism, you know, for about a month. And so it was actually a more hopeful time for those of us who take a progressive point of view. And so, if anything, I think I wanted to interrogate what I thought were pretty accepted and sort of mainstream positions now on diversity and multiculturalism, to start to have a conversation about, okay, what's the next step? And what about this needs to be rethought or continue to evolve?
It's kind of remarkable because those accepted tenets you're talking about, these ideas that of course you cast Asians as Asians, of course you want to have authenticity, at least in the casting, portrayal in key roles, because it's better for the story and it's politically, if you want to say, correct. And hey, it's also morally something that addresses the absence and erasure, and even worse, the yellow-face replacement of Asians throughout culture for centuries, right? At the same time, a lot of, I think, what is going on in Yellowface picks up on a theme in your work, which is nothing is ever that simple. You're not actually saying, no, this is, you're not pointing to something saying, this is the answer. We have actually gotten to a place where we can assume this to be true. There's constantly a pendulum swinging back and forth between the two extremes, and where you end up is kind of this ambiguous middle, which is challenging for audiences. I mean, I think a lot of us watching Yellowface and other works of yours do feel uncomfortable at the end because we want a closure that you don't necessarily provide, right? But at the same time, Yellowface in particular, it comes into a conversation where today especially, right, and we're going to move now to the version of it that's on Broadway today, we aren't necessarily as concerned, perhaps, about the same things that back in 2007, you know, you were interrogating. That there's a sense in which Asian leads, the whole attempt to find a hot Asian guy who can act, right? That's no longer a bridge too far. And so the decision to actually bring us back, right? What were some of the conversations you had to have to say, is this still going to work for these audiences?
So this Broadway revival basically came out of some something that started at the beginning of the pandemic, which was Lee Silverman, who is my longtime collaborator and director, who directed the original Yellowface, and we've done like 7 or 8 shows together. Lee, at the beginning of the pandemic, was like, oh God, we're never going to do theater again. Isn't it sad that nobody's going to get to see Yellowface? And why don't we try to do an audio version of Yellowface? So Daniel J. Kim, Daniel's company 3AD, had just started a partnership with Audible. And so that's how Daniel came into the picture as a co-producer. And then it took like 3 years to make all these deals. And so by the time we finally got around to doing it, the bulk of the pandemic was over. And we pulled together, I mean, the audio version exists. It's pretty great. It's a different iteration, of course. But it's Daniel as DHH and Ashley Hart and Benedict Wong as my father, Wendell Pierce as the reporter, Jason Biggs as Marcus. And we got as many people as we could together around the table and read it out loud, and it felt funnier than it did in 2007. And so I think there are ways in which the play speaks to today for good reasons and also bad reasons. So the good reasons are we start to feel like, oh, the culture has moved closer to the play because these issues of identity, appropriation, casting, representation, were slightly more niche issues, or I think at least a mainstream audience or white audience, wasn't. In 2007, they were a little nervous about laughing, and in 2024, they felt, oh, very much in the center of American popular discourse. So that's a good reason. The bad reason is that in 2007, it's like a pretty good time to be an Asian American. Like China is still really fun. And in 2023, 24, it's also a scary time to be an Asian. Just like the play portrays a lot of China panic incidents from the late 1990s, including the prosecution of the Chinese American scientist Wen Li. And we're at a moment now where everybody's, once again in this country, really panicked about China. And Chinese American scientists are once again being investigated. So that added to the spike in anti-Asian hate that happened during the pandemic, and the fact that the China virus guy is now going to be in the White House again, suggests that the play is timely, but for reasons that we would rather not have it be.
Well, they say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And for somebody who works with lyrics, rhyming can end up with a limerick, or it can end up with great epic poetry. And in this particular case, I mean, to your point about this being relevant, again, for good and bad reasons, and of course the recycling of political history that we're seeing, for me, there is absolutely a sense in which when you put anything on that was of a certain moment, right, there's a nostalgia factor. You're sort of transporting yourself back to then. But there are also layers and nuances that come from the transposition of time. And one of them, frankly, is, I mean, let's just say, like, the fact that you have Daniel Day Kim as the lead in this, to me, feels like the most poetic of poetic justices. This is somebody who, in many ways, has been the most visible person in our popular culture as Asian Americans, and certainly the person who is kind of like our personal hero, but who has never really kind of gotten the shine that he's deserved. He hasn't been number one, if you will, on the call sheet in his TV and film productions, and he's never had the opportunity to play a lead other than the King in King and I, right? Which on Broadway, which in a way is a role that has almost been reserved for whoever the most present day iconic Asian American figure who can kind of sing and dance to play. And for him to play DHH in this just seemed like a squaring of the circle, like a closure. A closure you don't get in other ways, but certainly on stage, seeing him there was remarkable. And of course, he was the one, like you said, who brought this forward as an audiobook. The first question I want to ask about that is, in working with Daniel, right, how did you talk about what you wanted him to bring to his portrayal of, well, you?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's incredibly flattering to be played by Daniel Day.
You're basically twins.
Yeah, right. I was thinking, oh, this would be how like Aaron Brockovich felt, it's Julia Roberts. But one of the ways in which Daniel in particular intersects with this role relates to what you were just talking about, that DHH in the play is an activist who, as I said, is trying to protect his reputation as an activist. And Daniel is someone who actually is an activist. And then, so to watch him kind of scramble to and lie and do all these things to try to protect himself and make himself look good, there's a matchup between the character he's playing and his own real life persona, which is, I think, adds to the comedy is quite delicious. And also, people don't know that Daniel Day Kim can be funny, so that's a big revelation. But we talked about, mostly, like, I definitely didn't want him to do the hair and the, weird hair and the beard, because, why would you want to make Daniel Day Kim look like anyone other than Daniel Day Kim? But it's really that trying to capture the sense of somebody who their activism and their reputation is important to them. And then what happens when that person makes a mistake. And I like the fact that in 2024, this show is also saying it's okay to make a mistake. We all make mistakes. You have to take accountability at some point, but you can move on from that because we're trying to do some things that haven't been done before. And of course, there are going to be some things that go wrong.
I just want to know how America could make the same mistake it made in 2016 in 2024. That's what I want to know. But to the point of Daniel and what it means for him to play this role, again, as DHH, the central question of the play is essentially, how do we find a hot Asian male who can be charismatic on stage and convincing to a theater audience? And, of course, he's the one actually using all this. And, like, the answer's right there, dude. It's like, he is the guy who is asking this question, right?
Right. I think it's also, and you're sort of saying this as well, it's also about, wow, in 2024, we, in a season on Broadway, which has multiple celebrities, from, Robert Downey Jr. to Denzel Washington, and you need a star to be in a play on Broadway this season, that there is an Asian American star, there's actually more than one now, who could play that role both artistically and commercially, who will be able to sell tickets. So that's a really important breakthrough in and of itself. But yes, there's a moment when Daniel's playing DHH and he's standing on stage saying, all we have to do is find a straight, masculine, Asian-leaning man. And the meta of that is that, yes.
Where could we find that, right? I think, that also speaks to the culture and how it's changed. In addition to racial and ethnic shenanigans, one of the things your work has frequently commented on is gender roles and expectations around them, and the stereotypes that are attached to them, especially when those things intersect. Asian men, Asian women, what do people expect differently, across that gender and race divide? And we are now in an era where hot Asian men are kind of everywhere, it feels like. post-cracertations, if you don't have a six-pack, what are you even doing? I want to speak to that real quickly before pivoting to talking about some of your other works, because the thing to me that I see as the real breakthrough, right, for our culture, as much as I love Cracertations, as much as I love Shang-Chi, as much as I love all the works that feature Asian men who flex and ripple, is actually the fact that Jimmy O Yang, who's funny as hell, has like a latter day new chapter as a romantic hero and action star, right? He's somebody who, when I look in the mirror, I'm like, that's Jimmy O Yang. That's not David Kim, right? And I wanted to ask you about that because even in not just Yellowface, but also and Butterfly and FOB, that whole question of what it takes to be an Asian man and perceived as masculine is a core question. So what's new now?
Well, you bring up Jimmy O Yang, and I have to say that I did a conversation a couple nights ago with Charles Yu and Chloe Bennett about the new Hulu series Interior Chinatown, in which Jimmy O Yang is the lead. And yeah, Jimmy O Yang does not have a six-pack, and he still can be the romantic lead now, which, by the way, has been the case for white actors for a really long time. So that is a significant cultural change because not only in terms of what it means to be an attractive Asian man, you don't have to be perfect looking. You can still be just a regular looking guy and be a romantic lead, and that's a huge shift in the culture. And Interior Chinatown is great, by the way.
I cannot wait to see all of it. I have screeners. And honestly, if we keep on talking about pivot points in the culture, that is one which I expect will actually unleash a whole new wave of conversation around these things.
What I want to add about Broadway in that regard is that, when we think about Broadway shows with Asians, chances are you're thinking about a show that's set in Asia, whether it's Miss Saigon or South Pacific or King and I or whatever. Up until the aughts, there was only one show in Broadway history that was ever about Asian Americans, and that was Flower Drum Song, read in the original version and Hammerstein iteration in my version. Now there have been some other shows on Broadway that feature Asian American stories, but for Yellowface to be on Broadway, one reason that, I started my career in the 1980s, so I thought, only my shows that are set in Asia are ever going to get to Broadway. So it's incredibly satisfying for an Asian American story to be on Broadway.
Again, this is what is different now. And again, some things are the same. And I do want to actually now talk a little bit about soft power, right? As we discuss again the rhyming of history. Here we are again. You wrote soft power, in the wake of Hillary Clinton, running for office, and at that time we all thought, hey, this is an opportunity. We're going to actually see a woman president, right? And that turned out not to be the case. And here we are in 2024. Once again, woman president, Asian president, black president, not so much. I want to ask you, because soft power did have a revival in DC. What do you have to do to make that play work in the wake of so many of the things we've seen since then? Because you had to rewrite parts of it, right? You had to rethink it.
Yeah, so Soft Power is a musical that I wrote with the composer Janine Tesori. We did it at the Public Theater right before the pandemic in 2018. And it's essentially about a reverse King and I, where a Chinese national comes to the U.S. and falls into a relationship a romantic relationship with Hillary Clinton just after she loses the 2016 election. So, you know, and it did fine. You know, it was a finalist for the Pulitzer that year, and we were Grammy nominated that year. But the whole question of getting to Broadway, first of all, there was the pandemic, and then it was, you know, Biden was president, and Janine and I continue to feel, you know, there's stuff that we want to fix. It's just too unwieldy, this musical. So we did this new version at Signature Theater, which is just outside DC, over the summer, and we're very happy with this version. And I thought, you know, in the best of all possible world, Harris becomes president, and maybe the show doesn't need to come back to New York. So I will say what I said to Lee Silverman after the 2016 election, which was, well, I think this will be bad for the country, but it could be good for our show. So we'll see.
Silver linings. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have not seen it, it is really quite brilliant, and much like your other works, very meta. It's from the perspective in many ways. It's a musical within a play, right? And I haven't seen the latest version, but in the version I saw, it was kind of framed by this commentary, because the production was something being put on by China as a way to help understand America and all our craziness, right? And I don't know if those are still.
Yeah, we simplified that a little because we started to like, wow, and it also involves the fact that I was stabbed in the neck a number of years back, and so that's in the musical. So it's meta in that regard. But one of the big differences between the public theater production and the one we just did over the summer is a wonderful white actress played Hillary in 2018, and we decided to go with an all-Asian cast at Signature, and now this fantastic Asian American actress named Grace Yu played Hillary in DC, and was fantastic, and just recently sang a number from the show at one of the theater manifests. But that felt right too.
That is remarkable, because it is something you also play with in Yellowface, kind of cross-casting, forcing people to interrogate what it means to actually have somebody with a certain face on stage playing a certain role. But to actually go that step of casting an Asian person in the role that is singularly supposed to be white, it's you know, ironic, but beautiful.
Yeah, and it is one of those things where as soon as Grace Yu came on stage as Hillary, after 2 minutes, it was completely cool. Like you totally felt like you were watching Hillary.
So the last thing I want to ask before we go to break, and then maybe come back into our signature segment, is about the emerging cycle of plays, the DHH cycle, if you will, where it does feel like you are tracking beats in your life on stage, you know, doing that kind of trauma bonding with the audience, kind of on-stage therapy. But that's 2 plays now where we've seen DHH as a character, both Yellowface and now Soft Power as well. Do you see this as something that is going to continue? Is there a DHH trilogy that's going to happen?
Yeah, I kind of hope not. You know, the DHH and Yellowface was, I was you know, nervous that if I named the character for myself, is that self-indulgent, which is actually going in the play. And then with Soft Power, it's just like my stabbing started getting into it, and so it just kind of made sense to call the character DHA. Hopefully I do not have another major trauma like that, such that I would then write myself into another piece.
You know, so we can, as audience members, we can both hope and also fear that that might be the case. Well, we're going to take a quick break now, and when we come back, we're going to do our signature segment, our favorite segment, the good, the bad, and the WTF. So stick around. So we are going to come back in and I think just go right into this. Unless you guys want to literally stretch. But yeah, so this will be a shorter segment, of course. But what we'll do is we'll do the three tiers. Each one is separate. So first the good.
Set me up, but what are we doing about the AK, or are we doing about serious credits?
No, I think we'll do about David Henry Hwang, because one of the things I want to talk about is where you see yourself now. Because we can talk a little bit about the honest stage. Yeah, I know you can talk about anything. All right, so if we're ready, we're going to come right back in. Okay. All right, and we're back with David Henry Hwang, and getting ready now to do our signature segment, our roundtable segment, the good, the bad, and the WTF. For those of you who are listeners to our podcast, you know that this is where we take a single topic and serve it up three ways with our guests. The first is the positive side of it all. The second is negative. Third is the WTF, which could be positive, could be negative, could be neither. But it's just the thing that you're still sort of puzzling over. The thing that makes you go, and we like it because it makes for an opportunity to bring in anecdotes, alternative perspectives, to cover stuff which doesn't necessarily flow into a standard, conversational dialogue. Especially since in this case we want to do the good, the bad, and the WTF of being David Henry Hwang, which I'm assuming you're kind of an expert in, or at least learning to be. So, David, let's begin with the good, because again, this is a special moment we feel for you. It is a moment when I think people are actually discovering lost gems of yours, but where you're doing work in more places about more things than I think ever in your career. So let's talk about what's the good to you about being David Henry Hwang?
There's a lot of good at the moment, and I think one of the things that has been challenging about getting to have a long career is how do you continue to stay current, stay relevant, stay fresh, to take risks. I remember when I was first starting out, I took FOB to something called the O'Neill Playwrights Conference, which is something that happens every year in Waterford, Connecticut. And I was chosen to be part of that. And we had guest speakers, and one of them was Arthur Miller, and the critic for a major publication who had become a supporter of mine said, it's Arthur Miller. You're writing better at the beginning of your career than he's writing at the end. Thank you, but and it really was sort of a cautionary tale for me about, okay, if I'm lucky enough to get to do this, and I move forward, what is my life going to be like at in 30 or 40 years? And am I going to be kind of that old thing? And I do think that American playwrights, because I've been just very conscious of this question over the decades, American playwrights do go through a period, assuming you even get to stay out there, where you're a little bit like, you're like last week's meal. But if you're lucky and you stick around long enough, sometimes that comes around. And I think about Edward Albee. I think about even Stephen Sondheim. Went through a tough period. And I went through, not that critics really mean anything, but they do determine your career, just sort of whether or not people are going to go to your shows. And I went through a period in my 20s where I had a New York Times critic who was on my side, Frank Rich. And then I went through a period starting in my early 30s where the head critic, Ben Brantley, we just didn't see eye to eye. And I just didn't get a good review in the New York Times for literally 25 years. So at that point, I felt like, okay, it's just really good that I have a career, because that's hard to do. And so now to be getting these reviews for Yellowface, And David, you mentioned Times Critics Pick, and I've never been a Times Critic Pick in my entire career, and I haven't gotten a good New York Times review since I was 31. So now, as an adult, getting to experience that is very satisfying, and it's really satisfying to feel like, oh, you were part of what motivated cultural change, but then I'm still, if not young enough, at least vital enough to be able to continue working and availing myself of some of the opportunities that exist now that didn't exist when I was younger. So, just in the art of an artistic life, that's the good.
Not quite a redemption arc, but nevertheless a validation arc, at least. And I will say, I mean, you're not the only person in this room and in this culture and in this society. There's some frustration with the New York Times now and again. But that also points to perhaps the bad, right? Looking at where you are now and where we all are now, what is the bad of being David Henry Hwang?
So I get to work on a lot of things that I'm interested in, and at least try to move forward projects on subjects and stories that interest me. One of the things that I find frustrating now is that I would love to do a project for film or television about U.S.-China relations. And particularly in TV, because TV, I feel like it would give me a way to kind of have some leverage and commentary on whatever situation is going to arise as the increasingly fraught relationship between these two countries plays out, and the concomitant ramifications on what it means to be Chinese American, Asian American. And I think it says a lot that everybody being Hollywood is so scared of this subject. Like, nobody wants to piss off China, so there's that. And then in this country, there's still a lot of fear, increasing fear about, oh, can we portray, well, American audiences want any portrayal of China that's more complicated and nuanced. So you have this resistance on both sides. And actually, I would say it was even worse. Well, it was worse 10 years ago because American studios, in particular, were more dependent on the Chinese market for Marvel movies or whatever. So they were really afraid of pissing off China. Nowadays, there's some platforms that are particularly sensitive to China, say Apple, because their supply chain goes through there, or Hulu, anything that's related to Disney. They don't want to piss off China. But there's still there's kind of, wow, it would be really interesting to do that, and then there's always no, we can't really do that. And so I guess I'll have to do what I did when I was starting out, and you couldn't get Asian American stories on film and television. I guess I'll just have to do it as a play.
It's funny because before we started this, I was talking to you a little bit about the notion of live theater as being kind of the oldest medium, right? And in some ways the hardest medium to make work because the resources you're dealing with are so volatile and so fungible. It's who's on stage and what they feel like at a given time. Are they sick? Have they lost their voice? Who's the audience? Do you have a soft and warm crowd, or do you have a hard and cold crowd? There are a lot of reasons why it's hard to make live theater work, and yet it persists and resists in many ways being pushed off to the side. It's the most vital thing, I think, still in many ways in our culture today. In part because you're allowed to do things that other mediums constrain us from. Which is maybe a good pivot to the final question, which is the WTF of it all. What is the WTF of being David Henry Hwang?
So I feel like the path not chosen for me was to go into music. I think I could have been a good record producer. I'm very interested in pop music. I grew up as a violinist because my mom's a pianist and my sister is a cellist, and I was a violinist in Chinese. So I studied violin starting from when I was 8. And I was an okay classical violinist, but I started to improvise in college and actually was much better as a jazz and pop violinist. I did a lot of that through my early 20s, and I was in several bands. One with the playwright Philip Convicanda. We toured. A lot of these recordings exist online. We toured up and down the West Coast, and I was really Philip's side man. He played the guitar and sang and read most of the songs, and I, did Philip. So there's that, and that's in the jazz fusion band, and another. I was in a punk band, which, and we released a single which has sort of become a cult collector's item. The band was called John Vomit and the Leather Scabs, and my punk name was Maggot Hwang. And this song can also, there's a song called I Suck, and a song called Punk Rockstar, and I co-wrote Punk Rockstar. And that music can also be found online, but also I think that we're going to get that single is going to get a re-release in vinyl, set up during the pandemic, and so far it hasn't come out yet, but hopefully it will. So, yeah, my thing is, like, I guess maybe if the theater thing hadn't worked out, maybe I would have gone into music.
Oh my God! I did not know this. I've known you for decades, and I did not know that somewhere inside of you, a maggot wand was trying to crawl out.
Well, I keep trying to get Philip Gokanda. Philip, if you end up listening to this, I keep wanting us to do a reunion concert, so we should be doing that.
Oh my God. Okay, we got to get the band back together again. But that is amazing, and thank you for saving that for the final drop here. And that does it for our game, our 3 rounds. Before we sign off, though, I just wanted to ask, are there projects you want to talk about that you're working on stage and off?
Oh, thank you. We just had the closing performance yesterday of an opera at the Metropolitan Opera. Thank you. Called I'm at the MOCA, which I wrote with the Argentinian-American composer Osvaldo Bolívar about the murder of the Spanish playwright poet Federico Garcia Lorca by the fascists in Spain in the 30s. So it just finished at the Met. However, those of you on the West Coast, the production will be coming to LA Opera in the spring. Also, another new opera at San Francisco Opera in the fall will be The Monkey King, which Monkey King opera that I'm writing with composer Von Rowe. Yeah, then there's a number of film television things that I think are going to get to see the light of day, and a musical about a very unlikely subject called Particle Fever, based on the documentary, which is about theoretical physics. It's about the discovery of the Higgs boson, or the God particle, at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Switzerland. So that may see the light of day, I would say, 2 or 3 years down the road.
Wow, that is certainly sounds hummable at the very least. But I can't wait for any of those and all of those things to happen and be part of the audience for all of those. Thank you so much, David, for doing this, for having this conversation with me and with all of us here.
Great, thank you. This is really fun.
the last thing I want to do is just ask, how can people find you online?
I left Twitter/X a while ago, so I'm on Instagram at the David Henry Hwang, and also I'm trying out Threads at the David Henry Hwang, and I have a website, davidhenryhwang.com.
All right, follow him. Thank you, guys. All right, that is it for the podcast. I'm going to stop the recording. Well, leave the recording going. And now let's open it up for questions from the audience. If anybody wants to ask David anything while we have him in the room, right here.
Just for the record, okay, the show makes it sound like I worked on the Margaret show, but I did not. I just lifted that bit with Margaret's permission from her stand-up, and then pretended like I was the character she was talking about. But really for television, I mean, I worked for 4 years on a TV show called The Affair on Showtime, and I learned so much. And I was created and showrun by my friend and former mentee, Sarah Treen. And yeah, I'm show running, or theoretically, I ran a writer's room for a TV show called $1 Billion Whale, which is based on the book by these two Wall Street Journal reporters about the one MPV scandal, which some of you are nodding. Jolo, the Malaysian guy who scammed $6 to $8 billion from the sovereign wealth fund of the United Arab Emirates and Malaysia, and used it to, among other things, finance blue people in Wall Street. So we're at a pretty, we've got season 1 figured out. We've got our first 5 episodes written, and like a lot of shows, we're just kind of waiting for the money to actually go make it. But so TV, obviously, has changed so much in the past 10 years. 2013 marks the emergence of House of Cards, and that really changed everything. Then there was this huge period where my friend Elena Smith, who was the creator and showrunner of Dickinson, Elena talks about the media companies and the tech companies essentially did this huge transfer of about $1 billion, $2 billion to creators to create, edgy, stand-out content, which would get eyes onto these new platforms. And now, particularly post-Stripe, everything is retrenching. Now they just want to be profitable, so there's a step backwards, both in terms of the sort of risk-taking nature of things that they want to produce, as well as diversity. Diversity, I think, is still considered a good business model by TV platforms and studios, but they're more cautious than they were 3 or 4 years ago. So that's kind of where we are. There's not as much stuff in production, and a lot of people aren't working as much as they used to, and it's kind of a tough time.
Well, it's called show business for a reason, right? And I guess we had some shows of Everyone Chinese, Warrior, Brother Sun, good reviews, Rotten Tomatoes, but somehow the bean counters look at the numbers and just say, not enough. I mean, there's only 6 million Asians in this whole country. So how can we ever get the numbers up? Because obviously, one of my biggest pet peeves is that a lot of the Asians buy the pirate DVDs or the black box, and they never go out and support product. And as long as that is, how can we ever produce those numbers?
If I can actually answer this one first, because I actually just did led a research team to create that question. How do you actually make money and not just art, right? How do you actually ensure that there's a firm, sustainable reason why you're going to create these stories, not just because they're great stories to tell, because people watch them, there's money behind them, and they will be profitable, right? And the first thing is this. I mean, there actually are 22.4 million agents in the United States, which is, considerably larger than it has been in prior census counts. It is much larger, especially the shrinkage of television audiences, than most of the audiences for television today, right? Like, I will tell you, Rush Hour was canceled when it was getting, around 0.9 share. Translating to like 10, 11 million people watching it, 30 million people watching it on Fridays. Terrible time to be airing it, but whatever. At that point in time, if you look at the Nielsen record, which I did for this report, you saw that in the first few seasons, this giant sort of over-indexing of Asian viewers, right? Asian Americans came out and watched the show. By season 6, Asian American viewing declined significantly, right? And instead, you saw many more, white viewers, African American viewers stayed persistent, but Asian Americans moved on. And that told me two things. One is the show itself had changed, right? But also television had changed. Asian Americans weren't watching linear network TV anymore. They were watching streaming platforms. They were watching, their eyeballs were in other places. And if you're going to actually create something and target towards this audience, you need to peek where those eyes are. So what we're seeing now is that the most interesting stuff that's happening is happening via the streaming platforms. But the other thing that has shifted is after the pandemic, after 2 years where people ran out of things to watch because, people were making new things, right? And they exhausted all their vast supply of The Office and Friends that they hadn't watched before 5 times. They started to turn to other places and explore other kinds of content. One of the things they watched was stuff from overseas in subtitle. And if you remember, right before the pandemic, none other than Bong Joon-ho was basically saying, look guys, you Americans, if you would only just get over that 1-inch high hurdle of subtitles, the whole world would open up. Well, during the pandemic, that happened. And today, to this very day, Netflix, I think something like 40% of global Netflix watchers have viewed some form of K content, Korean content, right? Anime is the #1 most watched thing by 2/3 of Netflix viewers under a certain age, like under 35. And what that really says is that there's a normalization of Asians on screen, what doesn't necessarily translate, as we've discussed before in other conversations, to Asian Americans on screen. And yet, there is definitely that hurdle, that sense of like, can we actually expand people's diet to a place where they're not saying, oh, what is that person on screen? They don't look like me. I can't watch them with an Asian face and feel empathic, place myself into that protagonist. We all grew up watching white TV, and we all managed to be empathetic, right? We're finally in a place where a big portion of America has stepped over that 1-inch high hurdle, but even more importantly, have surpassed that sense of like, we can't connect with a protagonist who is Asian or who is different from ourselves. So that's what I think is the future. I think we're no longer necessarily going to be telling stories that are so kind of persistently conscious of being Asian American, right? Instead, that sense of Asian American is being normalized, hopefully, to a place where we can tell any story, and it will have an Asian American protagonist without us having to actually wear a T-shirt saying, "Hi, I'm Asian American."
Yeah, personally, I don't know what the numbers were, but I thought Beef was a good example.
Yeah, absolutely.
But somehow the Korean dramas are so popular. That means quality matters.
Oh, it does.
You look at the Chinese made movie, like Chinese series, and you look at the Korean series. I mean, the Korean series draws fantastic amount of people. So maybe it's maybe they tell better story. They better actors or whatever the reasons are. I think Asian dramas are doing very well.
I mean, we can also look to a period when Hong Kong movies were super popular with the general audience, Taiwanese movies, and early, just when China was starting to loosen up a bit, Chinese movies reached, reached a worldwide audience. So it's not necessarily the provenance of any particular Asian nationality. I do think that so long as there's kind of top-down content controls that exist in China, it's my feeling that they're not going to create anything that the rest of the world's going to want to see. But I could be wrong. That might be just an American point of view.
Let's go back here for a second. I just wanted to understand a little bit more. Should you go forward with that piece of China and the U.S., what's your perspective in terms of going into that?
Oh yeah, I don't know. I don't know the story. I mean, I really, like publishing early talks, early attempts. And I think I get annoyed by the sound.
That's what you do. Over here.
I actually wanted to ask you a question regarding your upcoming work about Hadron Collider and discovery of the God particle. In writing about science, do you feel that because writing about science can often be an exciting topic for writers, do you feel that there's difficulty or excitement or a need in pitching your work to producers or studios when it comes to the scientific elements? Do you feel like they shy away from things they deem as too highbrow or too intellectual?
That hasn't been like, I mean, this wasn't I didn't initiate this project. So this project was brought to me. And it was just a strange enough project for a musical. But yeah. And interestingly, then somebody else approached me about doing sort of an industry-like TV show set at CERN, which is, be different than the discovery of the Higgs boson. And I don't know if they just think I can do it because I'm Asian, or but no, I don't. I feel that of course there is the sense that it needs to be about the characters, and you don't want to give the audience too much of the science if they're going to get bored. But the producers don't seem to be shying away from that.
Okay, I think this will be our last question. Okay.
So I don't think it's an accident that the representation of Asian Americans in film, television is happening. Because if you look at sort of the number of Asian American authors, right, the tremendous growth of really prominent, great writers now moving into television, moving into film. But I don't see that yet in playwrights. Is there something different about that? Like, who's going to be the next David Henry Hwang? Where is that coming from? I love going to the theater. I mean, I don't think until we have that, you're not going to have that representation because they're not ready for it from their own experience.
Yeah, I would take issue with that because I think that there's a big wave of younger Asian American playwrights. And when we say younger at this point, than me, we're talking about two generations, at least, or three Asian American playwrights. So, whether it's actors like Ma Yi or Nako or at places like the Public or the Atlantic, or there's a lot of Asian American playwrights that are doing amazing work. So I wouldn't worry about that so much. The question is, why are so few of those works getting brought up? And that, I think, can start to change as we have more, bankable stars. For the same reason that Yellowface can be on Broadway. But I feel that theater, Broadway theater in particular, has been slower to change than film and television. And I believe that's because Broadway theater, at least before the pandemic, had been perfectly healthy financially. They had, there was okay, yeah, we want to be more diverse, but there was no financial imperative to do so because they were doing really well with just kind of older, richer, wider audience. And post-pandemic, I think there's been more struggle on Broadway to come back. Currently, we're having a good season, but so therefore, I'm hoping that there's more imperative economic to change, and that would open things up the way that I think it has in film and television.
They don't call it the Great White Way for nothing. All right. Thank you guys.
Yeah, so, well, if you are still around, we also have another panel discussion, but then literally in about 15 minutes, around 3:30, it's actually a magazine reunion panel discussion. So it will be, we'll once again have Jeff, Angelo, one of the former editor-in-chief, and also have our Amy Chu in the audience as well. So then, yeah, so stick around. Yeah, thank you.